Musicality in poetry can be achieved in many ways, but perhaps most obviously through meter, rhyme, alliteration, and word choice. However, because poetry, like music, often requires a very personal response from a reader, it can be difficult for that reader to really see what makes a poem musical or pleasing to them. After spending some time looking over the 4 poems for analysis, it suddenly became clear how important it was to put these poems in date order. There is a definite progression in these 4 pieces that could easily be lost if they are taken out of chronological order. Like the development of a piece of music, these poems seem to show the development of a poetic form, a fact which I hope I can go at least partway to explaining. And so, with this aim in mind, I'm going to start with the earliest piece, an excerpt from The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, written in 1592. In the 15th century and early 16th century, poetry was still written in a variety of meters, but gradually over time, iambic pentameter became the predominant form, especially for English verse. Having its roots in Greek, iambic pentameter consists of 10-syllable lines divided into 5 pent feet, or iambs of 2 syllables, where the second syllable is stressed more heavily than the first. This formal structure creates a definite rhythm within poetry, and rhythm, as we know, leads to a certain musicality. Marlowe was a master of the iambic pentameter, and the chosen excerpt is in blank verse, non-rhyming, 10-syllable lines split into 5 unstressed, stressed iambs. The passage can be quite easily divided up into these 2-syllable iambs just by using sound alone, and we can see how cleverly Marlowe has placed the words so that the stress falls on the most significant words within each line. For example, face, launched, ships in line 1, and eye, wound, heal in line 12. However, there is a kind of rigidity to this poem, and one has to be careful not to concentrate too much on the meter. Let's see what happens when you do. Here will I dwell, for heaven is in these lips, and all is dross that is not Helena. Nasty, isn't it? And so one must allow the natural flow of words to take over, bringing some continuity between lines. And notice how Marlowe encourages his readers to do this by using enjambment to allow a flow from one line to another. Yes, there is always a place to pause at the end of each line, usually signaled by a comma, but fluidity is definitely being encouraged here. In this way, the unnatural chanting effect is neatly reduced. So then let's look at a second poem, an extract from Paradise Lost by John Milton, written in 1667, when the iambic pentameter had really just begun to take over as the preferred form for poetry. Milton is a real stickler for the meter, and as we saw in Marlowe, it can become quite hypnotic if you read this poem concentrating on the iambic stress. Unstressed, stressed pattern. I'll read a couple of lines to give you an idea of what I mean. Where joy forever dwells, hail horrors hail, infernal world, and thou profoundest hell. Receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. Again, it still sounds rather forced, but it highlights how cleverly Milton manages to work the words so the stress falls on the major words in the line. He is not quite as focused on this as Marlowe was, so we are already seeing some relaxation of the rules. Still, if we were to read this poem this way all the time, I doubt whether Milton would be being taught in schools today, and he realized this too. That is why he knew that he had to somehow prevent his poem from sounding like someone with an injured leg walking downstairs. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Milton did this by using enjambment and caesura. Not wanting his lines to seem as if they had the same length and wanting his poem to sound more like natural speech, he created falsely longer lines. Hail horrors hail, infernal world, and thou profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, for example, actually takes up 3 lines of the poem, and yet because of the way Milton has divided it, he had to be good at math, it still fits perfectly into the iambic pentameter rule of 5 feet, each one unstressed, stressed. Indeed, notice how few of Milton's lines are end-stopped. Only 2 in this whole section, although there are several that end with a colon or comma. Milton has cleverly manipulated the blank verse to prevent it from sounding like a chant. yet has subtly maintained both the iambic pentameter and the desired stress on the words of importance. Note also that this is still blank verse, and that there is no rhyme scheme. The musicality comes almost solely from the meter, with a couple of nice bonus touches, such as the alliteration of phrases like "Farewell, happy fields," and "Hail, horrors, hail," and then the pairings of "A heaven of hell, a hell of heaven," and "To reign in hell, then serve in heaven," which trips very easily off the tongue and create pleasing balance. And so, where do we go from here? Milton has added some life to blank verse, creating a more fluid, more natural-sounding poem, and adding some very creative punches with alliteration and pairing. Our next piece, an excerpt from an essay on criticism by Alexander Pope, deals with a slightly different form of poem, that of heroic couplets. Here we still have predominantly iambic pentameter, but now there is also a strict rhyme scheme. AA, BB, CC, DD, and so on. The addition of this throws the focus quite dramatically to the end of each line. The ability to read the poem with the same forced emphasis is still there. But the addition of the rhyme scheme is rather like the addition of another instrument into our poetry orchestra, and it creates a whole new flow and feel to the work. There is a level of expectancy created by a rhyme scheme, and breaking it would be much like a false note in a piano piece. Imagine Twinkle Twinkle Little Star with the wrong note at the end. The strict rhyme scheme of heroic couplets definitely adds to the musicality of the poem, and yet, just as strict iambic pentameter was chant-like, this tends to be a little too obvious, a little forced. Each line break at a pause, and every second line is end-stopped. We are reminded of the Marlowe's blank verse, which had the same fixed line breaks. So how does the poet counter this? We can see two ways in which Pope cleverly works with the poem's form to soften the effect and create a more interesting and more varied musical experience within his work. Notice the line, "flies o'er the unbending corn and skims along the main." Poe has managed to fit 12 syllables into this line, which actually speeds up the line and emphasizes the meaning within the line at the same time. Clever. The other technique he uses to keep his readers from focusing too much on rhyme is by using alliteration. Take, for example, the lines, "Soft is the strain when zephyr gently blows, and the smooth stream in smoother numbers flows." Alliteration of the S sound draws attention away from the rhyme scheme and encourages the reader to focus on more than just the end of each line by creating interest throughout. Our final piece for analysis is from My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Written in 1842, this piece is also written in couplets, iambic pentameter couplets, and here we see a further development of the form, or perhaps we could say further evidence of the poet pushing the form to its limits. The 10-syllable lines are still in evidence, as are the unstressed stressed iambs. There is an addition of a rhyme scheme similar to that of the heroic couplets, but now we no longer see the restriction of each line being end-stopped. Enjambment has further softened the form, allowing the reader the opportunity to flow fluidly from one line to another. Take, for example, the lines, "The bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace." Written this way, it seems like a narrative, not a poem, but when viewed within the poem itself, we see how clearly Robert Browning has tampered with the rules of the poetic form to create a piece that still has a certain musicality, but which has moved very far away from the severity of the original iambic pentameter and even the heroic couplets. Not happy with just vandalizing the rules, Browning ends the piece with a dramatically shortened line, as if he wants to leave the reader in a state of shock. Although he has created a poem that retains the musicality we tend to admire, he has finished with an almost orchestral flourish, a cymbal crash that really wakes us up. Musicality has been taken from the more primitive chant to a true orchestral level.